Douglas MacArthur. A born soldier, Douglas MacArthur was one of the most famous generals of World War II. Despite suffering a tremendous defeat against Japan at the beginning of the conflict during the Philippines campaign, he masterfully resumed operations from the South Pacific through an endless adventure that ended with the crossing of the border into North Korea at the start of the Cold War. Child soldier. Douglas MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880, in Little Rock, a town in Arkansas, United States. From the moment the baby came into the world, he was destined to be a military man because his mother, Pinky MacArthur, gave birth to her son inside the barracks fort, which at that time was an arsenal of the U.S. Army. Douglas MacArthur's father was the famous officer Arthur MacArthur, a Union hero and a Civil War veteran who had been awarded the Medal of Valor for his action during the Battle of Missionary Ridge. This is how, in this completely militaristic environment, due to his father's frequent assignments, young MacArthur grew up happy in a world dominated by military life. In fact, on one occasion, as a child, he heard the sound of gunshots against Native Americans in Arkansas after an assault on a series of white settlements. Upon reaching adolescence, MacArthur studied at the Public Force School in Washington, where, right after graduating and becoming a handsome young man, he secured a place at the West Texas Military Academy after his father was transferred to San Antonio. MacArthur quickly adapted to the disciplined life of the U.S. Army, excelling especially in sports like tennis, baseball, and rugby, where he was even chosen as the team captain. Military career. Like his father, MacArthur wanted to pursue a military career, so in 1898, at just 18 years old, he entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His performance as a cadet was impressive, with grades above 98.14 out of 100, even achieving a perfect score of 100 out of 100 on one occasion. After 4 years at the Academy, he graduated at the top of his class in 1903, a rank that in the 20th century was surpassed only twice in the United States. Just a year later, in 1904, he was promoted to lieutenant and finally secured a position in the Corps of Engineers. As part of the Corps of Engineers, MacArthur traveled to the Philippines to work as an assistant to his father in the construction of barracks, who at the time held the rank of general and commander of the archipelago, as well as chief of the Pacific Department. It was precisely in the Philippines where MacArthur formed a special bond with the country, quickly falling in love with its landscapes, people, and culture. Later on, many would say that MacArthur was as Filipino as he was American. He even had the opportunity to travel across Asia with his father during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, passing through the following route and schedule: Nagasaki, Kobe, and Kyoto in Japan, Shanghai and Hong Kong, British mandates in China, Java, Dutch colony, Singapore, British possession, Madras, Tuticorin, Quetta, Karachi, and Khyber in India, Bangkok in Thailand, Saigon in Vietnam, French Protectorate, Canton, Tsingtao, Beijing, Tientsin, Hankow, and the international settlements in Shanghai, China, before finally returning to Japan and going back to the Philippines. Due to his father's influence, in 1907, MacArthur became a military advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt in Washington, a position he held at the White House until the completion of his term. In 1908, he took command of an engineer company at Fort Leavenworth, and in 1911, he was promoted to captain, a rank with which he led several surveillance missions at the Panama Canal that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. All these roles allowed him, in 1912, to become a part of the general staff of the U.S. Army, just as winds of war were beginning to blow across the nation. Veracruz Incident and the Great War. When the Veracruz Incident occurred on April 21, 1941, in which the United States intervened militarily in Mexico, MacArthur had to learn Spanish in record time and march into Mexican territory. Under the command of a patrol of 15 soldiers, MacArthur ventured along a railroad line in the desert until he encountered a squadron of cavalry made up of 15 Mexican rebels. Immediately, a firefight ensued, forcing the enemies to flee, but not before MacArthur had taken down 4 of the Mexican guerrillas. Shortly after, the American patrol collided with another group of Mexican cavalry who charged at them. MacArthur managed to repel the attack, killing 2 of the rebels and 1 of their horses. Essentially, these types of skirmishes shaped the entire campaign in Mexico, where MacArthur focused on infiltration missions behind enemy lines and acted as a spy in a disguise as an Indian. When the United States entered World War I against Germany in 1917, MacArthur's mission was to create an expeditionary force from scratch. However, as recruitment and training were slow processes, he came up with the idea to include veteran units from the National Guard, which he named the 42nd Infantry Division Rainbow, also known as Rainbow. This idea increased the number of volunteers across the country and their enlistment at Camp Mills in New York. Interestingly, one of the recruits was an officer named Harry Truman, who would later become the President of the United States. It was through his innovative approach to recruiting men that MacArthur was promoted to general, becoming the youngest general in U.S. history up until that point, earning him the nickname Boy General. Officially, on October 18, 1917, MacArthur landed in France in command of the 42nd Infantry Division Rainbow, which was deployed on the Western Front in the Luneville sector. His first taste of combat would not come until the Second Battle of the Marne in 1918, specifically between the Marne River and Champagne, when a small group of soldiers led by MacArthur infiltrated an enemy trench and captured several German prisoners. For this action, France awarded the American general the Croix de Guerre, War Cross. The following month, on March 9th, MacArthur led his 42nd Infantry Division Rainbow against the Fez salient, where another large number of German soldiers were captured. However, during the battle, the Germans launched poisonous gas, causing some casualties among the Americans, and MacArthur's lungs were affected because he put on his gas mask too late. Fortunately, once recovered from his injuries, MacArthur returned to the front on June 26th to lead the defense of Chalon, a mission he completed flawlessly. During this period of the conflict, MacArthur earned the respect of his men, who saw him as one of their own because he always exposed himself at the front lines just like them, refused to wear a helmet, and set up his command post at the forefront, which was uncommon among generals at the time. By the summer of 1918, the situation in the Great War shifted in favor of the Allies when they went on the counteroffensive through the 100 Days Offensive. During this period, MacArthur's 42nd Infantry Division Rainbow fought between the Meuse and Argonne rivers. In fact, on September 12th, MacArthur emerged victorious in the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, and on October 14th, he was slightly wounded in the fight for Châtillon. Starting in November, he led his men relentlessly through Sedan between France and Belgium, where, ironically, he was captured by an American soldier from the 1st Infantry Division who mistook him for a German general. Once the misunderstanding was resolved, MacArthur continued leading his division through the lowlands of the Rhine River, capturing the German district of Ahrweiler, coinciding with Germany's surrender, which ended World War I. For his actions during the conflict, MacArthur would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Upon returning to the United States in 1919, MacArthur was appointed director of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the same institution where he had graduated as a military officer just a few years earlier. There, he introduced several changes, such as reducing the number of officers, shortening the cadet courses to just 2 years, and implementing modern weapons training at Fort Dix. He also gave an interview to the New York Times to dispel rumors that the Academy was using undemocratic methods in its teaching, significantly bolstering the institution's prestige. Once again, in 1922, MacArthur was sent to the Philippines to inspect the military situation after the reduction of the U.S. fleet by the Washington Naval Treaty. In 1923, MacArthur had the opportunity to fight in command of the 23rd Infantry Brigade of the Philippine Infantry Division to suppress a rebellion organized by the Philippine Scouts, who protested their low wages. However, MacArthur, far from being lenient, defeated the rebels and captured 200 Filipinos who surrendered. Due to his effectiveness in operations in the Philippines, MacArthur gained the trust of Filipino President Manuel Quezon and became well known among Washington officials who called upon him for a new mission. This time, he was sent to the Netherlands to head the United States Olympic Committee during the 1928 Amsterdam Olympic Games. His work was exceptional, and both in sports and in war, MacArthur contributed to his country's success, with the United States outpacing Germany and Finland to win 56 medals, including 22 gold, 18 silver, and 16 bronze. MacArthur's first wife was Louise Cromwell Brooks, a woman from the upper class of Philadelphia. However, shortly after their marriage, unhappiness settled in. She was a sophisticated socialite, while MacArthur preferred a modest life, wearing military uniform, sleeping in a hammock, and smoking cigars or corncob pipes. Unable to understand each other, they divorced in 1929, and Louise quickly married actor Lionel Atwill. At 50 years old and single, MacArthur returned to the United States as Chief of Staff in Washington. From this position, he advocated for the need to modernize the armed forces with new weapons such as ships, vehicles, tanks, and especially airplanes, warning that the next conflict would not be static like World War I, but mobile, with significant advancements. Unfortunately, despite his insistence, no one listened, and due to the economic crisis, no funds were ever allocated for such projects. Unexpectedly, in 1932, the Bonus March occurred in Washington, a protest by 20,000 World War I veterans who were affected by unemployment and poverty and had never received the compensation promised by the government. MacArthur, of course, shared the sentiment of these Bonus Army veterans. However, despite sympathizing with the protesters, the general had to obey orders from President Herbert Hoover to send the U.S. Army to the streets to disperse the demonstrators through a violent bayonet charge. This action almost ruined his career due to the numerous deaths and injuries. To cover up the incident, the new President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to move him away from Washington and transfer him to the Philippines for a third time. Curiously, when MacArthur returned to the Philippines in 1935, he resigned from the U.S. Army and voluntarily joined the Philippine Army as a foreign advisor with the intention of modernizing it. Quickly, MacArthur gained the respect of the Filipinos, and President Quezon awarded him the rank of Field Marshal, a distinction marked by an ornate hat full of braids. During this period in the Philippines, MacArthur also discovered a new military talent under his command, young General Dwight David Eisenhower, who would later hold a similar position during World War II and become President of the United States during the Cold War. MacArthur fell deeply in love with Jean Faircloth, a beautiful 35-year-old woman from Murfreesboro, during his third stay in the Philippines. They married on April 30, 1937, in a civil ceremony at New York City Hall, forming a successful marriage that would last for life and result in the birth of their only child, Arthur, on February 21, 1938. When World War II broke out in Europe, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the need to reinforce the Pacific Ocean against the threat of Japan. This led him to overlook the Bonus March incident and reinstate MacArthur in July of 1941 as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army in the Far East. Over the following 6 months, from headquarters at the Manila Hotel, MacArthur organized a mixed army composed of Americans and Filipinos, a project that was completed successfully, earning him the position of Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Philippines, with a salary equal to that of President Manuel Quezon. In fact, just before the start of the Pacific War, MacArthur's Philippine Army had 12 divisions with 148,000 troops, although only the Philippine Scouts Division had a complete roster with 37,000 men. Coinciding with the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, Japan suddenly began the invasion of the Philippines. The first few hours were key in the development of the battle, as MacArthur made the mistake of refueling his bombers to attack the island of Formosa. During this time, Japanese planes appeared over the airfields and dropped bombs, destroying a total of 103 American planes on the ground. Without control of the air, the American and Filipino armed forces were easily defeated after the Japanese landings in Luzon, Mindanao, Jolo, and other places. MacArthur was precisely the last to leave Manila before it was occupied by the Japanese and took refuge with most of his troops on the Bataan Peninsula, where they held out until the 9th of April 1942, when they were defeated with nearly 115,000 casualties, including 25,000 dead. He then fled with the last survivors to the island of Corregidor, where, from an underground tunnel, he led a final battle against the Japanese, who had landed on the island with the intention of capturing him, which earned him the nickname Doug the Buried. Before this could happen, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered him to leave Corregidor to lead the fight against Japan from exile. Reluctantly, MacArthur had to leave Corregidor with his family, escaping on the motorboat USSP-41, which managed to evade Japanese patrols and underwater mines in heavy storms before boarding a plane and seeking refuge in Australia. Meanwhile, the garrison of Corregidor suffered a severe defeat with 27,000 casualties, including 15,000 dead and many prisoners. Upon arriving in Australia, fully aware of his responsibility for the gigantic military disaster, General MacArthur vowed vengeance with one of the most famous phrases he ever uttered: "I shall return." Psychologically devastated by the loss of the Philippines, which became part of the Japanese Empire, MacArthur in Australia tried to rebuild the United States Army in the Far East, which had been completely destroyed during 1942 and the early months of 1943. The first thing he did was prepare the defense of Australia in case of a potential Japanese landing, and recognize a Filipino government in exile, led by his old friend Manuel Quezon, whom he used as a propaganda tool against the Japanese puppet administration of the Second Philippine Republic under President Jose Laurel. He then requested reinforcements from the mainland and tried to convince President Roosevelt of a strategy focused on Pacific First, to prioritize the Pacific theater over the European one, a proposal which Roosevelt rejected. Thus, without Roosevelt's approval, MacArthur designed a new plan called Leapfrog, consisting of defeating the Japanese by invading island after island until reaching the heart of Japan, while bypassing less strategically important islands with enemy garrisons neutralized from the air or blocked from the sea. As the proposal was well received by the American commanders, Roosevelt approved the plan and appointed MacArthur Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific in coordination with Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Central Pacific, with whom he would have many competitive frictions throughout the conflict. New Guinea was chosen as the site for MacArthur's counteroffensive in the Pacific, where he positioned his troops to join the Australians who had been resisting around Port Moresby for nearly 2 years. During the time MacArthur operated in New Guinea, he defeated over 750,000 troops in numerous local clashes against the Imperial Japanese Army, leading a mixed army of Australians and Americans in local engagements like Bunagona, Finisterre, or the Huon Peninsula. He always knew how to leverage the publicity of his victories, for when the Americans won a battle, he presented it as a victory for the United States, while when the Australians won, he portrayed it as a victory for the Allies. However, MacArthur did not limit his operations to New Guinea, but also extended them to the surrounding archipelagos of Bougainville, New Georgia, New Britain, Rendova, Vella La Vella, Choiseul, Ley, Treasury, Hollandia, Biak, Vogelkop, and the Admiral Islands. However, MacArthur never completed his campaign of conquest either in New Guinea or in the Solomon Islands, as the monsoon climate and the fierce Japanese resistance in the jungle slowed operations, which had not concluded when he was assigned to the new mission of recovering his beloved Philippine Islands. Under the name of Operation King II, on the 20th of October, 1944, a day known as D-Day, American troops under MacArthur's command, based on the cruiser USS Nashville, landed in the Philippines, precisely on the island of Luzon. After the first wave hit Red Beach, MacArthur, wearing sunglasses and aboard an LST landing craft, set foot in the Philippines, dipping his legs into the water while rifle and artillery fire was still being exchanged nearby. He was accompanied by the new Filipino president, Sergio Osmeña, and General George Kenney, among other military officials, when he suddenly exclaimed, "I have returned." Immediately after, The first thing he did once the perimeter was secured was to meet with General Frederick Irving of the 24th Infantry Division in a nearby palm grove to seize a radio. Once he had taken control of the radio station that had a direct link to the Filipino resistance called Voice of Freedom, the general announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. Thank God Almighty, our forces have set foot on Filipino soil once more." During the rest of World War II, MacArthur's troops fought exclusively in the Philippines. His greatest achievement was the conquest of Manila after a fierce battle that left 100,000 dead and ended with the complete destruction of the country's capital. He also led operations against other islands and archipelagos of the Philippines, such as Mindanao, Mindoro, Panay, Negros, Cebu, Corregidor, etc. Since the Philippines was made up of more than 1,000 islands, MacArthur never had time to retake the entire archipelago, nor even Luzon itself, as before that could happen, Japan announced its unconditional surrender on the 14th of August, 1945. It was MacArthur who had the honor of presiding over the Axis surrender on the last day of World War II, the 2nd of September, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, receiving the Japanese delegation in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese representatives, who expected a harsh reprimand from the victorious general, heard instead a manifest desire for peace. MacArthur's last words before concluding the ceremony with an impressive aerial parade were, "Let us pray that peace may be restored throughout the world, and that God will preserve it forever. The session is adjourned." After the end of World War II in 1945, MacArthur was appointed governor of Japan during the occupation and head of the Supreme Command of the Allied Forces in the Pacific, SCAP. He quickly won the trust of the Japanese civilian population, establishing a genuine friendship with the native citizens, a sentiment that also spread to the American soldiers occupying the country, almost as if there had been no war between the two nations. In fact, MacArthur himself became very close friends with Emperor Hirohito, whom he received in complete confidence, wearing only a shirt and no jacket, something that greatly contrasted with the Japanese mentality. Among his duties as governor of Japan, MacArthur provided the country with a new constitution that recognized democracy and a constitutional monarchy, through which the emperor became solely a symbol of unity and strength of the state, renouncing his divine origin as a kami. From then on, and progressively, he legalized all political parties and unions, introduced women's suffrage, enacted a law for freedom of expression and the press, dissolved the traditional business structure of the old zaibatsu in favor of a liberal market economy, and separated the Shinto religion from the state. From his office, he would give 3 radio addresses per year and occasionally fly over the areas affected by destruction in his personal plane, Bataan, to assess the reconstruction efforts. Due to his unusual behavior, he soon became known as the Caesar of the Pacific. MacArthur also contributed to the Far Eastern Tribunal for Japanese war criminals, ensuring that the guilty, such as former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were punished, with Tojo being executed by hanging. But contrary to his principles, MacArthur allowed Dr. Shiro Ishii, a doctor who had conducted experiments on human beings, to go free. He pardoned him so that he could transfer his knowledge of biological warfare to the U.S. Army for the upcoming Cold War with the Soviet Union. MacArthur's decision to keep Hirohito as emperor also caused much controversy, as he did not sit him on trial for conspiring against peace. This maneuver was MacArthur's effort to convince the new U.S. President Harry Truman that the best option to keep the Japanese population content was to respect the imperial Yamato family after 2,000 years of history. While working in Japan, some leaders of the Republican Party in the United States proposed that he run for elections. MacArthur was unsure if it would be appropriate, but ultimately he agreed to run, though from a distance. However, his political career was doomed, as after losing the primaries in the Wisconsin elections with 8 out of 27 electors, and in the Philadelphia elections with 11 out of 1,094 votes, he rejected the Republican nomination. Suddenly, in 1950, North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea without a declaration of war, a nation protected by the United Nations, which irrevocably triggered the Korean War. Almost instantly, MacArthur was put in charge of the UN forces to liberate South Korea, which was almost 90% occupied by North Korean communists. Meanwhile, MacArthur organized a multinational army that included a conglomerate of many nationalities under his command that he had never imagined: South Koreans, Americans, British, Canadians, Turks, Australians, Ethiopians, Filipinos, New Zealanders, Thais, Greeks, French, Colombians, Belgians, South Africans, Dutch, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, Italians, Indians, and Luxembourgers. On the 15th of September 1950, MacArthur became the architect of the greatest military victory of his life after leading the UN warships through the Yellow Sea without being detected by the enemy and anchoring off the coast of Incheon, a location very close to Seoul, where thousands of Allied soldiers landed and expelled the North Koreans. 10 days later, on the 25th of September, American and South Korean forces recaptured the capital of Seoul after a bloody battle, and MacArthur entered victorious, raising the United Nations flag. In the following weeks, the UN forces would expel the communists from South Korea and penetrate North Korea. Inside the enemy country, MacArthur's soldiers advanced rapidly, conquering city after city until they stopped not far from the enemy capital of Pyongyang. Just when MacArthur had victory within reach, the People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong, intervened in the war on behalf of North Korea, launching a massive counteroffensive with over 1 million men along the Yalu River. The UN forces were unable to defeat the Chinese and were forced into a chaotic retreat back to the border with South Korea, where the front lines stabilized once again. Thus, by 1951, Korea became a battleground similar to World War I, as both sides remained in fixed positions with neither advancing nor retreating, as both sides had unlimited human and economic resources provided by the superpowers. Due to this uncomfortable situation on the 38th parallel, MacArthur ordered airstrikes using B-29 superfortresses to bomb North Korean cities, destroying numerous towns and villages and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Slowly, President Harry Truman began to lose patience with MacArthur, and in 1951, he met with him on Wake Island to discuss a solution to the static war in Korea. MacArthur, a staunch anti-communist, proposed using atomic bombs, or at the very least, bombing Chinese military bases in Manchuria, a plan Truman opposed to prevent a military escalation that could trigger World War III. As MacArthur was not satisfied with the outcome of the meeting, he publicly criticized President Truman through Republican Congressman Joe Martin, a serious breach within the military, which on the 11th of April 1951 inevitably led to his removal from command in favor of General Matthew Ridgway. Interestingly, when his assistant Sid Huff delivered the letter of dismissal to MacArthur while he was dining with 5 guests at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, he calmly responded, "Well, let's go." Shortly afterward, angry at the punishment, MacArthur sadly acknowledged, "All the leftists of the world will be happy today." After the Korean War, MacArthur returned to the United States, where he was greeted by crowds as a hero in New York and San Francisco. He was also invited to Congress, receiving countless applause to express one of his many well-known phrases, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Following his military retirement in America, MacArthur's life became less hectic, except for an unsuccessful attempt to run as a candidate for the Republican Party in 1952 and serve as an advisor to the Remington Rand Incorporated Company. Meanwhile, he dedicated himself to traveling and taking long vacations with his wife Jean, spending his free time writing 2 memoirs titled Reminiscences and Soldier Speaks. As a token of gratitude for his services in the Pacific War, Philippine President Carlos Garcia awarded MacArthur the Philippine Legion of Honor in an emotional ceremony. Also, President John F. Kennedy sought his advice in 1961 for the subsequent failed invasion of Fidel Castro's Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs incident. Even in 1963, he participated as an advisor in preparing the United States for the Tokyo Olympic Games, scheduled for 1964. Douglas MacArthur passed away from bile sickness following an intestinal surgery at the Walter Reed Hospital in Washington on the 5th of April 1964. 150,000 people attended his funeral, including Japanese Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda, in a massive procession held in Washington in front of the Capitol. His remains were buried alongside his wife in Norfolk, with the following inscription written on his tombstone: "In a campaign where valor was the standard, he stood out among all for his courage." Without a doubt, Douglas MacArthur was the United States general who experienced the most action in the 20th century. The Mexicans in Veracruz, the Germans in the Great War, the rebels in the Philippines, the protesters of the Bonus Army, the Japanese in the Pacific, the North Koreans at Incheon, or the Chinese communists at the 38th parallel were just some of those who had the misfortune and the honor of falling victim to the expertise of the man once known as the Boy General. Dwight Eisenhower. General Dwight Eisenhower was one of the most prominent military figures of World War II because he was responsible for commanding all Allied forces with millions of troops from various countries. He was also the mastermind behind the invasion of Europe during the D-Day landings in Normandy. Thanks to this remarkable record, during the Cold War he reached the presidency of the United States, making him one of the key figures of the 20th century. Dwight David Eisenhower was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in a city in the United States called Denison, Texas. His parents, David Jacob Eisenhower and Elizabeth Stover, had German ancestors, specifically from Karlsbrunn, from where they had to leave in the 17th century as a result of the wars of religion, curiously, the same genes of the nation that would later be subdued. At just 2 years old, Eisenhower moved with his parents to the city of Abilene, where they instilled strict Christian values from the Mennonite religion and immersed him in the Brothers of the River sect, a community that met once a week to pray and read the Bible. However, despite his evident religiosity, what truly attracted Eisenhower was sports, and thanks to his physical condition, standing at 1.80 m, he had the opportunity to practice various disciplines. Upon reaching adulthood, Eisenhower found himself without money or financial means, so he had to enroll in a military school that offered the necessary subsidies to study. This is how he entered West Point in 1911, where he quickly became an outstanding student, devouring books on tactics and excelling in sports such as baseball and American football. Once he graduated as a second lieutenant in the United States Army in 1915, ranking 61st out of a list of 164 students. Curiously, the top student was Omar Nelson Bradley, who would later be his companion in World War II. His grades stood out in all other subjects as well, scoring 38 in conduct, 82 in drill, and 102 in mathematics. Outside of his professional life, Eisenhower met a girl from Iowa named Mamie Dowd in Denver, whom he fell in love with at first sight and married in 1916. The marriage, which would last a lifetime, produced 2 children whom they named Dowd and John. With the United States' entry into World War I on the side of the Allies in 1917, Eisenhower, who had just been promoted to second lieutenant, did not have the opportunity to be sent to the Western Front in France with the rest of the U.S. Army, which was fighting against Germany at that time. Frustrated by this, he had to remain in the country instructing 6,000 recruits to operate tanks, a very recent weapon that was still in development, where he stood out for conducting excellent research at various camps in Texas and Pennsylvania. After the Great War ended with the victory of the United States, misfortune struck Eisenhower's family when his son Dowd died of scarlet fever in 1920. Despite the sorrow this event caused him, he soon recovered psychologically from the pain. In 1930, he was promoted to the rank of captain at Camp Meade, Maryland, a position that seemed very low for someone at the age of 30. Fortunately, his luck changed in 1922, when General Connor Fox offered him the position of his assistant at the U.S. Army garrison in the Panama Canal Zone, where he worked enthusiastically until his return to North America in 1924. Upon his return, he was admitted to an officer's course for the General Staff, which was taught by General George Patton, who, foreseeing the future of his student, remarked with the following words, "I have the impression that one day I will have to be under your command." As a result of coincidence and fate, Eisenhower had the opportunity to meet General Douglas MacArthur during a visit to the War College in Washington in 1933. This veteran officer, who had distinguished himself on the Western Front during the Great War, took notice of Eisenhower from the beginning and offered him a position in his department office. Thus, the two formed a close friendship over the next 2 years, until in 1935, MacArthur transferred him to the Philippines to jointly command both the United States Army and the Philippine Army stationed in the archipelago. From that point onward, Eisenhower settled in Manila, the capital, and carried out an intensive program of fortifications in Luzon to defend against a possible Japanese invasion. In 1940, Dwight Eisenhower was promoted to general thanks to his work in the Philippines, which required him to immediately return to the United States to be appointed as Chief of Staff of the 3rd U.S. Army. In command of this group, the young general focused on conducting massive maneuvers in Louisiana, in which more than 270,000 men participated. He also found free time to live with his family, play golf, and even practice oil painting. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, summoned Eisenhower to prepare a report on the Philippines, which were being invaded by the Japanese Empire at the time. Once the document was presented, Marshall was so impressed by the professionalism of the report that he asked Eisenhower to prepare another one based on the guidelines a Supreme Commander would need to follow for operations in Europe. Once he wrote it out in his own hand, Marshall's astonishment led him to immediately speak with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House to advise him to appoint Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of the Western Allies, since in his opinion the U.S. Army needed young leaders with initiative, not a military caste stuck in old principles. Surprisingly, and against all expectations, Roosevelt accepted Marshall's proposal and immediately appointed Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe. Officially, in July of 1942, General Dwight Eisenhower took up his position as leader of the Western Allies, establishing his headquarters in England alongside the first American troops that landed in the British Isles and the first planes of the U.S. Air Force that arrived near London. From then on, he coordinated the first air bombings over Germany and successfully managed the landing in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, which on the 8th of November 1942 neutralized Vichy France in North Africa. However, many criticized his decision to appoint French Admiral François Darlan as the new leader of Free France in the Mediterranean area due to his fascist past, though time would prove Eisenhower right, as thanks to his choice, the resistance from the Vichy army was minimal, saving many lives. The baptism of fire for the U.S. Army, commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower, against the German Army and the Italian Army, specifically the Africa Corps of General Erwin Rommel, went poorly as the American troops were defeated with more than 10,000 casualties in the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. However, despite this setback that made him the target of criticism, Eisenhower managed the situation by coordinating with the British 8th Army under Marshal Bernard Montgomery and relying on the U.S. Army of General George Patton, who, attacking from the east and west respectively, ended up annihilating the Africa Corps and conquering Tunisia. Once North Africa was occupied, Eisenhower oversaw the direction of Operation Husky, which led to the successful invasion of Sicily, and Operation Avalanche, which saw landings at Salerno, Taranto, and Calabria, eventually leading to the surrender of Italy as a member of the Axis powers. During all of these campaigns, Eisenhower earned the reputation among his soldiers of regularly visiting the front to raise their morale, something that earned him the affectionate nickname of Ike. In fact, he never hesitated to reprimand equals and even his superiors when he believed they were making a mistake, as he did with General George Patton, General Charles de Gaulle of Free France, and even Prime Minister Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom. By the end of 1943, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, settled in London to take command of the upcoming invasion of France. He chose an exceptional team for D-Day, consisting of Omar Nelson Bradley as General of the 1st U.S. Army, Bernard Montgomery as Marshal of the 2nd British Canadian Army, Arthur Tedder as Deputy Marshal of the Supreme Allied Headquarters, Bertram Ramsay as Admiral of the Allied Naval Forces, Trafford Lee Mallory as General of the Allied Air Forces, and Walter Bedell Smith as General-in-Chief of the Allied Cabinet. The collaboration of these experts and the meticulous preparation of Operation Overlord, which involved landing on 5 beaches in Normandy called Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, preceded by paratrooper and commando drops behind enemy lines, ensured success from the outset. Interestingly, Eisenhower himself visited the paratrooper troops on June 5, 1944, at an airfield and fraternized with the soldiers just hours before they set off on their mission. The following day, June 6, 1944, the Normandy landings took place, resulting in thousands of casualties for the U.S., British, and Canadian forces. At the same time, the Allies achieved a resounding victory, consolidating a beachhead in Western Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower was one of the military leaders who commanded the most armies and troops throughout history. Approximately 4 million men, including Americans, British, Canadians, French, Poles, Czechs, Dutch, Belgians, Norwegians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Africans, and many others, along with tens of thousands of tanks, planes, cannons, and ships, were under his command during World War II. This formidable fighting force was responsible for victorious campaigns such as those in France and Belgium, although also some failures, such as Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands and the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. Despite having to hide in the Paris headquarters during the Battle of the Bulge, after fearing an assassination attempt by German commandos, he eventually changed the course of the battle, and his vanguard forces destroyed the German army in the Bulge, ultimately crossing the border into the Third Reich in 1945 and invading Western Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Eisenhower received numerous criticisms after the end of World War II for ordering the Western Allied forces to stop at the Elbe River, which allowed the Soviet Union to capture Berlin and gain a significant territorial advantage in the early stages of the Cold War. He was also held responsible for the deaths of thousands of German and other Axis soldiers who were left to starve in prisoner-of-war camps across Germany, the so-called Eisenhower camps, a scandal that did not prevent him from being appointed Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in November of 1945. With the onset of the Cold War and back in the United States, Eisenhower left active service in 1948 when he was elected president of Columbia University. Taking advantage of this absence from the U.S. Army, he wrote his own book titled Crusade in Europe. Once finished and published in 1950, he returned to military life, being appointed Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a position he held at NATO headquarters in Paris until 1952. Surprisingly, and despite having promised never to get involved in politics, in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower changed his mind when the Republican Party offered him the opportunity to run for the presidency. The campaign was easy because it basically consisted of denouncing the human cost of the Korean War in the Far East and the resistance around the 38th parallel in the face of attacks from North Korea, promising that he would end the conflict initiated by President Harry Truman and combat communism through more effective means. This anti-communist and patriotic speech was also greatly supported by his past as a wartime leader during World War II, unlike his opponent, Adlai Stevenson of the Democratic Party, who was practically an unknown figure to the American public. On January 20, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower won the election with 34,075,529 votes for the Republican Party and 27,375,090 votes for the Democratic Party, thus becoming the 34th President of the United States of America. As soon as he assumed the presidency and appointed Richard Nixon as Vice President in 1953, he achieved a ceasefire between North Korea and South Korea, which resulted in a demilitarized zone around the 38th parallel, just as he had promised during his electoral campaign. Simultaneously, on the domestic front, he began a long fight against corruption, expanded oil refineries, opened a waterway with Canada through the Great Lakes, and began constructing a dense network of highways. He also defended the rights of African Americans, such as abolishing the law that required people of color to give up their seats to white passengers on public transportation. Regarding the fight against communism abroad, he authorized the first flights of U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union, threatened Communist China under Mao Zedong with using the atomic bomb if it dared to invade the island of Formosa, which was controlled by the Kuomintang of President Chiang Kai-shek, and collaborated in the partition of North Vietnam from South Vietnam after France's defeat in the Indochina War. Once again, on November 6, 1956, President Eisenhower won his second term with 35,579,180 votes for the Republican Party, compared to the 26,028,028 votes for the Democratic Party, led by Adlai Stevenson. Curiously, among the most controversial decisions of this administration within the national sphere was the definitive elimination of racial segregation between blacks and whites in both schools and universities, as well as ensuring equal opportunities regardless of the ethnic origin of any American. Meanwhile, in foreign policy, Eisenhower succeeded in establishing a détente with the Soviet Union in 1959 through a meeting at Camp David with the leader of the Soviet Communist Party, PCUS, Nikita Khrushchev. At the same time, he had to deal with various international conflicts, such as the Suez Canal crisis with Egypt, the Hungarian Revolution in Budapest, or the Sinai War between Israel and the Arab League. He even had to publicly confirm that a U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down after violating Soviet airspace. However, one of the biggest successes of the Eisenhower administration was the reaffirmation of the space race with the Soviet Union, as after the Soviets put the Sputnik satellite into orbit, Eisenhower pushed for the creation of NASA, which would eventually lead to humans reaching the moon. On January 20, 1961, outgoing President Dwight Eisenhower left the White House to welcome incoming President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. After completing his term, Eisenhower retired to a well-deserved and peaceful retirement, residing on a farm just outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he enjoyed the countryside and nature. He also took the opportunity to write his memoirs in a book titled The White House Years, Waging Peace, which was published in 1965. Suddenly, on March 28, 1969, Dwight David Eisenhower passed away at the Walter Reed Military Hospital in Washington at the age of 78. With his passing, one of the greatest military and political leaders of the United States, both in the context of World War II and the Cold War, was lost.